Well, guys, I guess it's time for another Young Justice Season 5 newsletter. We're all anticipating some news for the show, and our excitement is not diminishing. But sadly, we still don't have anything definitive to go on. We're going to take a couple minutes to talk about what's going on over at Greg Weisman's Twitter account and the possibilities of him showing up at New York Comic Con, one of the biggest Comic Cons in the country and a great place to announce a potential Season 5. We're also going to ask the big question of who might be stopping Season 5 from happening and why that could come straight from the top. Now, as many of you know, we're still all waiting for some possible news on a new season of Young Justice. Season 4 closed out about 2 years ago, and although the show was not canceled, there was not a new order for a 5th season. Since then, we've been in limbo, something Young Justice fans are pretty used to, but we've been following Greg Weisman's account pretty closely and the developments at DC Studios that could be impacting the future of the show. Now, if you're following Greg's account, you know he's still doing the Young Justice countdown, and he's gotten down below 200. He's counting down to number 1, which will probably be the first characters to appear, which, if I remember correctly, was Robin. But he is finally drifting into the well-known characters and the well-established characters, and many of us are still speculating what happens when he gets to number 1. I don't know if Greg has a plan for all this, he definitely hasn't revealed his cards, but it is still cool to see him supporting the show and doing the character countdown. Greg has never shied away from talking to fans, and his social media has always been a great outlet. Now, with that in mind, recently he was asked a question by the Comic Book Reporter, and I think it's a pretty important one. Now, the two biggest Comic Cons in the United States are probably New York and San Diego Comic Con. We just had San Diego Comic Con, and New York is right around the corner, and this is often where we get some pretty big announcements. Now, to be fair, nothing's bigger than San Diego, but whenever these events happen, many of us start wondering if we're going to get some Young Justice news. Now, Comic Book Reporter actually reached out to Greg on Twitter and asked him if he was attending New York Comic Con this year, and Greg's response was a little disappointing. He replied, "I wasn't even invited." Now, sadly, in the last couple of years, when Greg has said this about conventions, he's never really been evasive with fans. He's pretty much been a straight shooter. So I do not expect him to show up at Comic-Con in New York, and I'm really not anticipating an announcement for a 5th season of Young Justice. Now, it doesn't mean it can't happen, it just means without Greg there, I find it very, very unlikely. Now, sadly, I think we finally might have a clue on what the delay is and why Greg might not be making it to this convention. And although I totally respect what he's doing and I completely love almost all of his work, I am starting to believe a lack of Season 5 could fall squarely on James Gunn. Now, recently we found out that the new DCU, well, they're going to be moving through multiple eras within the timeline. Heroes have existed for a really long time in this new world, and that suggests a full-blown history of this particular version of the DC Universe. Now, if you remember in Season 4, we really got a complete history of that DC Universe, where we found out the very complicated history with Vandal Savage and Clarion, and how not only did they play into the creation of metahumans, but also Atlantis, and really help drive and shape the world that Earth-16 eventually became. I actually think the big problem here might not be Gunn being a fan of the show, because he has stated multiple times he is. But what I really worry is the success of the show could potentially threaten, or at least feel like it's imputing on the success of the films. If Gunn has some similar villains coming our way, like a Vandal Savage or somebody who's lived for eons, I can't think of very many who have lived longer than Vandal Savage, except maybe Clarion, well, quite honestly, you could see why he would not want the show to continue and potentially step on his storylines and inhibit their development within the DC Universe. Now, I have no proof this is happening, and I want to be super transparent about that. It's just sort of a theory, but it does make a lot of sense when you're comparing the Young Justice timeline and how Greg developed things, which goes back super far in time and absolutely has a timeline setting up that world, and what James Gunn is trying to do, basically the same thing. Quite frankly, the Young Justice world might be too fleshed out, too developed, and too much of, well, competition to this other world. In any case, we're going to continue to follow Young Justice and hope for a Season 5. I would recommend you guys keep using those hashtags, Renew Young Justice Season 5, and Save Earth-16, as well as buying stuff from Amazon and other retailers. Dollars talk, and when DC sees money coming from these projects, that's what encourages them to make new series or renew series, and that's what Young Justice needs. Hopefully, this is the last Comic-Con without any good news, but I still think fans are probably going to have to push DC Studios and Warner Brothers to make this happen.